Today is November 28th, 2017. My name is Joe Todd. This is an interview with John Fears in Oklahoma City. Sir, where were you born?
I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma on October the 12th, 1946 at St. John's Hospital.
St. John. Who's your father?
My dad was Graydon, Graden. Middle name was Earl, and last name Fears.
And your mother?
Her name was Gladys, and Fears, of course.
What was her maiden name?
Brazil, just like it's spelled like the country, Brazil.
Yeah, okay.
And they were both, and their families came out of Arkansas and moved to Oklahoma during territorial days, actually.
Where'd you start school?
Because my dad accepted a job with Phillips in Bartlesville in December of '46, we moved up there just before Christmas. Mom said it was one of the coldest winters she ever saw in her life. And so anyway, Bartlesville was my home growing up. And I still look at it as my home in many ways, of course. I was raised there through high school. Mm-hmm. And
you graduated what year?
In 1964.
Okay. What elementary school did you start?
I went to Garfield Elementary School, which had a long history in Bartlesville. It was built about 1904 or something like that. It was the original high school, in fact, and loved it. It was an old school, but the schools were old in those days, and started in the fall of, I didn't go to kindergarten, started first grade in the fall of '52.
Okay. Who's your favorite teacher?
I had several teachers that I liked over the years. There were some elementary teachers that were really good teachers. In those days, you had teachers that were really professional teachers, and that was their life's mission. They weren't paid much, not paid what they deserve today either. But I would say, let me move. Well, Mrs. Littlefield was my first grade teacher, so she obviously had a big impact on me. But there were other teachers. There was Mrs. Jennings and Mrs. Vilu. I mean, they all were good teachers, and I loved going to school. Not saying I was the best student, but I enjoyed learning, and they were good teachers.
In high school, what did you do for recreation?
Well, by that time in Bartlesville, there was a YMCA, and a lot of us would go down there after school, certainly on Saturdays, and you could play ping pong, pool tables, no betting or anything, but you could do that. You could go swimming, and they had a basketball court, and you could go in there and shoot baskets, and I'd do that as well. Mm-hmm. And I played baseball all the way through high school, from Little League on. And so my summers were filled with baseball. And God looked down on me and had mercy on me and gave me just a little bit of baseball talent. And for that I'm thankful. And I love baseball, loved the old Yankees with Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra and Whitey Ford and all those guys on that team. Of course, Mickey Mantle was from Oklahoma, so Oklahoma boys liked Mickey Mantle a lot, and I did. And So baseball was a big deal with me. Played church league basketball for my church in a church league in high school. I wasn't on the high school basketball team. So, and that was fun. And we actually were so good my senior year that my church team came in second in the entire state. And they had a church league playoff of teams from across the state. And we got beat in the finals 70-37. A game that shall live in infamy as we got blown off the court by Morning Star Baptist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which we later learned was basically the Tulsa, Washington basketball team, who were, of course, great athletes.
What baseball team were you on?
I'm sorry.
What baseball team were you on? Did you play?
Well, I started out in Little League. They had majors and minors. The first 2 years I was in the minor leagues on a team called the Yankees. I don't know, I can't remember who the sponsor was. Or the White Sox, one of those. Anyway, and then when it was still Little League, but when I was 10, we had tryouts, so I was selected to the tie-ins, which was sponsored by H.C. Price Company in town. All the teams had sponsors. And that was the first time I had a full uniform. Before that, we had T-shirts and a little cap. And then I got a uniform, full uniform. They were wool to start out with, which was really hot in the summer. But that's the way it was in those days. And so I was on the tie-ins for 3 years, and they were champions of the American League. There were 4 leagues, 4 Little League leagues, and so we were champions. I didn't play much the first year. I batted .077 my first year on the tie-ins, so I only played a little bit. In the next 2 years, though, I finally kind of blossomed a little bit, and so I was the starting third baseman on those teams, and we won championships.
You climbed Circle Mountain?
I'm sorry?
Did you climb Circle Mountain?
I sure did.
What'd you do up there?
Just like every kid in Bartlesville, it was there, and it had to be climbed. I think there was a water tower on top or something, or some kind of a tank up there, I think. But, yeah, you climb up there, and you could just see for miles around in every direction. You had the Osage Hills and Osage Hills State Park to the west, just beautiful, those old blackjack oak trees up there. Of course, the trees in Bartlesville were just magnificent in the 50s and 60s before Dutch elm disease came through. Just beautiful. Fall, I mean, my gosh, the golden leaves on the trees, and they'd fall, and you just walk through yards, and it was just wonderful. A great town to grow up in.
I remember 14th Street. Looked like a tunnel with all the trees.
Yes. I mean, it was beautiful. And we lived in the 40s, late 40s, we lived on 9th Street. And I can't remember the nearest north-south street, but it was kind of south of St. John's Catholic School, southwest a couple of blocks, and in an old house right on the alley. I don't have many memories there because I was so young, except one night when there were some tomcats fighting out in the alley, and Dad went out with some fireworks that you could throw down and they'd explode. And he did that to get rid of the tomcats. And I have that memory, and then I have a memory of us moving out of that house. And they rented a house from the Catholic Church that was at 720 Keeler, right across the street there on 7th Street from St. John's School, Catholic school. And it was a little house, and that was just a great neighborhood. There were kids all around, and Dad just had to walk a few blocks downtown to the Phillips building, the old Phillips building where he worked, Then they transferred into the Phillips's Adams building after that was built. Later transferred into the third building downtown. I don't even know what they call it, but it was a big, giant building. And so he could walk to work from there, but we moved from there. I mean, it was a great place. I mean, it was just wonderful. I could ride my bikes anywhere. In those days, there was an old guy that used to come down the alleys, and he had a horse. And the horse's name was Dan. And we'd wait for him to come every morning to pick up whatever trash he wanted to pick up, and we'd feed the horse sugar out of our hands and stuff. And gentle horse. Sometimes we'd have an apple. The old man would just say, "Well, keep your hands flat when you feed him, you know, so he won't eat, bite your fingers." But it was. I used to play on the Catholic school grounds, and of course the kids would come down. They'd have mass, go to mass. We weren't Catholics. We were Baptists, but we were renting a house from the Baptist church. And I knew the old priest that used to be there in those days. And Father Lynch.
Father Lynch.
Father Lynch was his name. And he's real nice to me. And I'd go over there and I'd be playing cowboys and Indians or whatever. And I'd have my 6 guns on. And there was an outdoor altar next to the old red brick church. They tore that down and built a newer one with blonde brick. But I'd play in that courtyard there, and the Catholic Boy Scout troop that would meet there at the church, they called me Trigger, because I'd always come to their meetings just across the alley. But old Father Lynch, he'd talk to me, and I'd be around here playing with my 6 guns and stuff, and then the altar would be there, but I didn't really, bother it. I just played around it there. But he'd talk to me. He's real nice to me. And that was just part of my neighborhood, as a kid, and my imagination and everything. And he smoked a pipe, I think. But he never told me I had to go home or anything like that. He just talked to me and say, "Well, have a good day." And so it was a great neighborhood, and among my friends was Jack Smith, and he was a neighbor, lived up the block. I met him before we started school. And of course, Jack was killed in Vietnam on November the 12th, 1967. Big shock to me. And Jack and I didn't exactly hang out together in high school, but we'd see each other and we'd smile and say hi and stuff, And it was a big school. We had a couple of thousand kids in the school, so. But he was my friend, and we were part of a club called the 3 J's because our first name started with J, and had lots of adventures in the neighborhood. And we built a ship, called it the Robert E. Leake, built it inside a garage, this other kid's garage. And it was aptly named the Robert E. Leake. It might have floated, but it probably would have taken on quite a bit of water. And so.
You ever float the boat?
Huh?
You ever float that boat?
We didn't. I think some parents put a veto on on taking it out, but we had a little cabin on it and had a bench inside, and so we would just pretend like we were, fighting pirates or, sailing on the oceans and stuff. And it was just a lot of fun. Used up a lot of boards building it. I don't know who supplied the boards, but they were there, and so we put that thing together, and we'd get snacks. If we were going to go on a voyage, we'd get snacks and go. We would search for buried treasure and all that. Mm-hmm. So I miss Jack, and I was real sad that I was still in Oklahoma State when he was killed, and I was home from class. My wife and I were married then. We were students, and that was the fall of our senior year at Oklahoma State. And I was home. I was just watching the news. I was eating a sandwich and had a couple of afternoon classes. And I was just watching, and they announced it, that he'd been killed. And it was, it was almost like I wasn't hearing it correctly. And it just kind of took the steam out of me. So I kind of sat there. I think Judy, my wife, was in class. I'd just come home to eat, and then I was going to go back to campus. We lived close to the campus there in Stillwater in a place called Scholars Inn. They knocked it down, and it's now a parking lot next to Gallagher Iva. But it was on, I think, the ABC station. I don't know why I remember that. Maybe it's just because it's just what they were saying to me. And so it was just a real sad day. And of course, they didn't give you any details. They just announced that he was dead. And so.
Which department did your father work for in Phillips?
The what?
Which department did your father work for in Phillips?
He was in the engineering department.
Engineering, okay.
He was a civil engineer, and he was worked for the Army Corps of Engineers right before he got a job with Phillips, and he worked on the old runway at Tulsa Airport, and he also worked there at Camp Gruber for a while near Muskogee, I think. I've never been over there, actually. But then he drew up plans for all kinds of buildings. He worked on some of the hangars there at the Bartlesville Airport, because Phillips had so much to do with that airport, of course.
Remember Radar Hill?
The what?
Radar Hill, the Air Force Base.
Yes, that's right. There was an Air Force unit out there. You drive up, like you're going out to the Osage Hills State Park area there, and they had that radar dome out there. And I don't think there were too many airmen there, but I remember it very distinctly. And I'd forgotten until you just mentioned that. But that was just part of the landscape out there.
Which stores did you shop in Bartlesville?
Of course, when I was little, my mom did all the shopping, but sometimes she'd take me with her. And, the old C.R. Anthony store, which I still have memories of because it had those pneumatic tubes. And so if you wrote a check or if you paid cash, it didn't matter. The clerk downstairs would take it and they'd put it in one of those things in the pneumatic tube, kind of like you see at drive-in banks now, and it'd go upstairs, and I guess if it was a check, somebody upstairs, a manager, would have to approve it or something. And then those days they had counter checks. They're just sitting on a counter. Well, you'd write a check on it, they'd take that, and the bank would accept those counter checks in those days. Those times are long gone.
Yes.
But sometimes we just, my friends and I, if we were downtown, we'd go in Anthony's. And usually, their doors were usually open, unless it was real bad weather. The smell of dry goods, I can still remember the smell of Levi jeans and other dry goods in that department store. But we'd go in to look at those tubes and for a few seconds watch the things going, containers going up. And so she'd shop there for me. There were other stores downtown that eventually, like in high school, I think I got a suit. Well, you could get it at May Brothers, which we also got our Boy Scout uniforms at May Brothers. And so when I'd outgrow one suit, I only had one suit growing up ever, and that was to go to church in. And I think I went to Dan's Men and Boys Shop maybe a couple of times in high school. But I always had, always had a suit. It was, it wasn't a fancy expensive suit, but I always had a suit to wear to church. And if I had some special thing I had to go to. And later there was the Economy store, I think, when we were in high school. And bought a few things in there. But those are pretty much the places I shop now. You know, we'd go to the show downtown, and the Osage, the Arrow, the Lyric, the old Lyric, where they had cereals in the 50s. Lots of old B westerns. The Osage had the good movies, and it had a balcony. Although I think we usually sat downstairs, and they had the top movies that would go around town. I remember when Charlton Heston, played Moses in that movie, and I can remember a line of people waiting to get in and get their tickets for that. And that, I think, and whenever there's a real top movie, the Arrow had mostly westerns, maybe some other types of movies too. The Lyric went out of business because it was old and getting run down. I can't remember when it went out of business, but then we had the Osage and Arrow, had the Hilltop Drive-In, which, by the way, I learned was built in 1946. And of course, you go to the Hilltop in high school with friends, and they had Buck Night. Everybody could get in for a buck. It wasn't that expensive anyway. But going to the show was a big deal on Saturdays. And I lived close enough to town, we could just walk downtown and get a bunch of kids, and nobody worried about their kids. I mean, parents worry about kids, but we weren't worried about bad things happening, and so it's a pretty safe town. You could ride your bike downtown, walk downtown. But my dad used to take me, and that was something he and I did. He'd take me to westerns, mostly. He liked Randolph Scott and a few others. Joel McRae was one of his favorites, and he did a bunch of westerns. John Wayne movie, of course. Yeah, but he started me early, and when we went to the Lyric, I'd wear my 6 guns and had my cowboy boots and my cowboy hat on. And there was a little cafe, you may recall, right there in that alley as you'd go down to the street that the Lyric was on. You go down from Johnstone. Is that Dewey down there now?
Dewey
or is it Osage or Dewey?
Dewey or Osage?
It's Johnstone, and then you go down 4th Street. Anyway, there was Pioneer Drug on one side of the alley, and this little restaurant. It may have changed hands, but there's a little restaurant down there. I remember going in there, and
there's a Coney Island down there.
And but my dad would take me in there when I was little, and I mean, Perkins Newsstand was down there too. So I'm not quite sure what the position was for that little cafe. Calling it a restaurant was maybe a little bit too much. It was a cafe, but I remember I decided to go to town one time when I was really too little to go by myself, and I went down to that cafe and I ordered a grapette or something. And of course, Dad always paid when he'd take me in there when we'd go to the show. Well, they knew me because we go in there about every week, and so I said, well, she said, well, what do you have? And I said, I'm pretty sure I said a grapette. That was my favorite. And so she brought me a grapette. And as I was leaving, well, I didn't have any money. And she said, well, and she knew my name. She said, Johnny, that'll be a nickel. And I said, oh, just charge it to my dad, I don't know where I came up with that. But they told my dad later. Of course, it's just a nickel. So anyway, well, Mom got scared. I was supposed to be playing in the yard, so she called the police to go look for me. Well, I got home before the police found me. And so my mom was just as sweet as she could be. She only gave me one whipping, and that's when it was. she turned me over, and she was on the phone to the police as she was doing it. And I remember she said, "Well, he's home. I found him. Tell the policeman they don't have to look for him. He's right here." And he patted me on the rear end and hung the phone up. Of course, in those days, there was an operator, so you had to get the operator to get anybody. And so she had to get the operator and said, "Give me the police station." Anyway, so she didn't hit me. I cried, but she didn't. It was mainly that she was doing it that upset. So I learned my lesson. And there was 2 older girls in the neighborhood, so if I went to the show after that, while we were still there on Keeler, I had the older girls had to go with me. But so lots of adventures in the little town, and most of them were just really good. And
Go ahead. What did you study at Oklahoma State?
I majored in political science. I decided I guess I was impressed with Perry Mason, the TV show, and I think there was a show called Public Defender back in the 50s. And so and then we had a career night. I think I was in the 9th grade at Central Junior High School. And I remember a local attorney, I think his name was Heskett, Bill Heskett. I'm sure he's passed on by now. But came and talked about being an attorney. And so I just decided then I kind of formed this opinion that I wanted to be an attorney. Never been in a courtroom or anything, but it seemed exciting on Perry Mason, so I went there, and in those days you could study pre-law for 3 years, what was called pre-law for 3 years, and then go to law school. And they would give you, upon graduation from law school, they'd give you your college degree. It was kind of strange, but I chose political science. I took a lot of English, too. I can't remember how many hours. I don't know that I had a minor in English, but I took a lot of hours in English, in humanities, and lots of history, economics, and the basic curriculum that you had to take in college. I think there was a foreign language requirement when I was a freshman. I think they lifted that at some point before I graduated. But I had a BA in political science, graduated in May of '68. And I had decided at some point I was going to go in the Marines, and I had started to go through their platoon leaders class, where you go to Quantico for a commission. You go 6 weeks, 2 summers, but then I decided not to do it that way because I had to work in the summers and in between, school year sessions. And so then the war got going hot and heavy, of course. And
why did you join the Marines over the Army or the Navy or the Air Force?
I thought about all the services, but I had always just thought about joining the Marines. My uncle was a careerman in the Navy and graduated as a Master Chief Petty Officer. Retired. And he was in there for 21 years. He was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th and out in the Pacific during the war. I had another relative who flew P-51 Mustangs in Europe. And my great-grandfather served in the 1st U.S. Arkansas Cavalry during the Civil War. He was in the cavalry. He was a scout. And, of course, most of the state was Confederate. But some Confederate raiders had raided their farm. His father fought in the Mexican War in 1846, 1848, and died They just said of a fever. Who knows what it was? Of course, more people died of disease in those days than in battle. And so my great-grandfather's mother and he and his three brothers and one daughter were raised on this farm that was awarded to them because of his death in service. They got 40 acres in Arkansas. And so those are my roots coming forward. And you know, in the 50s and 60s even, early 60s, there were lots of films about World War II, the Korean War II. So I mean, I had great respect for all the services.
What's your great-grandfather's name?
Ebenezer Fears. And he didn't have a middle initial. And everybody, I understand, called him Eb. I think he died in the 1920s. He was a farmer. I have seen some of his records, and he had beautiful handwriting. Even though he grew up on a farm, he had a modest one-room school education. And I have his sword. It was passed down to a relative who gave it to my dad, and Dad gave it to me, and I have it at home. The handle's a little bit messed up, but I've kind of hesitated at having it fixed because I don't want them to mess it up. You know what I'm saying? It's still the way it was. And I put some preservative on it, and I may donate it to a museum someday, but I think I'm just going to pass it down through my sons. But I decided to join the Marines, and I signed up after graduation. I was told I was number 17 on the list to be drafted there in Bartlesville. I expected that because you had to keep your grades up to stay in college. So I knew I was going in.
When did you join the Marines?
I signed up September the 10th, 1968. And I remember the major swearing me in and saying, "Don't call your mother. You're in the Marine Corps now." I wasn't going to pull out, but I just thought, I didn't laugh, but it was kind of funny when he said that.
Where'd you go for boot camp?
Well, in the Marine Corps, there are different routes to get a commission. Some guys did go through boot camp as enlisted. We went, because I signed up for OCS, you know, and took a test, and because I had a degree, I went straight to Quantico for officer candidate school. All of us had the rank of private E1 all through OCS. Had been 12 weeks, but they're trying to get they needed lieutenants because of the casualty rate, and so they cut it down to 10 weeks. They basically cut out a lot of the non-combat stuff, you know, etiquette, officer etiquette, and that sort of thing. So 10 weeks, and after that, we went to what's called the basic school, and I'll tell you more about OCS, but we went to the basic school there at Quantico, a different part of Quantico, which is a massive base on a big national forest area. And that's 5 or 6 months of infantry training for lieutenants. We were all lieutenants, second lieutenants, and then you had to go through this, and platoon tactics, patrolling, map reading, calling in artillery and airstrikes and all that kind of stuff. The basics of what you had to know. And but my platoon was really interesting. Had a bunch of guys that had gone through boot camp, you know, but they'd scored so high, and they wanted to try to be an officer, and so they were selected for OCS too. They had to step up on us because they'd already been through quite a bit of boot camp, so they knew what to expect and what to do. Now, I had a rough idea. I mean, I've seen some movies and people talked to me, and it was a very sudden, life-changing type experience. There was no sympathy. I mean, a couple of sergeants came in and said, listen to my voice. Don't listen to anyone else. You don't do anything if I don't tell you to do it. And that's when we were in this big group of people. There were 8 of us that flew up, some from Oklahoma State, that had flown up out of Tulsa and for OCS. So anyway, it was, I don't know, it was January the 6th of '69, and it was like 6 degrees or something. It was really cold. It picked us up at National Airport in D.C., and it's about 40 miles south to Quantico Marine Corps Base, and the OCS part of it is in one section. The Marine One helicopters are real close to where the OCS is located there, or was at that time. And so they take us down there, and the sergeants we had were combat veterans. One had been in a Marine reconnaissance battalion. The other had been in an infantry unit. Both had been wounded. Both were decorated, as was our platoon leader, a lieutenant. The sergeants, that's who we had with us 95% of the time. There was a lieutenant, and he was there occasionally. And then we had a company commander who was Captain Christmas, later General Christmas, who commanded Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, in retaking Hue City during Tet of '68. And he fought through the entire 26-day battle. And after it was declared secure, they moved out into the countryside, and he was wounded by an RPG very severely, but recovered and took over our company. Very stern, stern though, taskmaster. And but getting back to OCS, it was about discipline, and we learned the Marine Corps way, hard discipline. And from that first night, we slept at attention in our bunks. After they issued our rifle, we slept at attention in our bunks. We went to bed 2, 3 in the morning, because when you check in and everything, it's late. 2, 3 in the morning, and then they got us up at 5. And they came in screaming, and I mean screaming, and yelling. Screaming is maybe not, it's yelling, and yelling orders. You know, get up, get out of the rack, stand at attention. So the discipline thing was immediate. It was like an electric shock. And some guys they were so tired they couldn't think, and they messed up. And so they came over and they threw the racks over, and you had foot lockers. And if they found this was constant though, if they found a foot locker that wasn't locked, they'd dump it out and stuff like that. But this one guy said, do what? And he was sleepy silly, trying to wake up. Do what? And so they went over, they took sheets and blanket, turned his rack over and had him doing push-ups. Well, that got our attention. So we didn't really know how to stand at attention, but we kind of, stood up like this, screaming. And there were 3 of them, head DI, senior DI, and then 2 others. They're just all over us. And I was right by where they came into the squad bay. There were 80 of us. They came in, and boy, I mean, when he yelled that first time, it was right in my ear because I was in the upper bunk. And so the guy below me had been in the Marine Reserve Unit, and I think he was like a Lance Corporal. Well, he was already up and dressed. What I learned was you get up before reveille, get dressed, and then you just stand at attention. And all the boot camp guys knew that. The rest of us were lost. But then there's another surprise. So I'm like this, and I look across the squad bay, and there is Tommy May from our high school class, Tom May. I didn't even know he was on the plane. I never saw him until we're standing at attention. Well, you're not supposed to laugh, but here we're looking at each other, and it's, you know. So anyway, Tom laughed, or smiled. He didn't laugh, he smiled. And one of the DIs was on him, just on him, down on the deck, push-ups, you know, till he dropped, you know. So anyway, okay, so I straightened up my face. I wasn't going to look at Tom ever again, you know. Later, after a few weeks and things loosened up and we had liberty on Sunday mornings, then, you know, we'd talk and stuff. But it was so regimented. There was, you know, you really didn't get to know anyone for those first couple of weeks. You just didn't talk to anybody. Talking just wasn't allowed unless it was responding to them. And you know, you had to call them exactly what their rank was and all of that. So anyway, so that started. And of course, cleaning everything, and we had to learn everything. And it was just, they were cramming this stuff into us. And eventually we'd start going to classes and teaching us stuff about the rifle, you know, how to break down a rifle, eventually a machine gun. More on the weaponry that we had to learn because it extended through the basic skill too. But it was just like that. And the first night though, we had to write a quick note home. Tell them you are doing fine. And you will write another letter when you have time. And you put it, I don't know, we put the letters somewhere, somebody carted them off. They didn't want any senators, calling. So we had lots of college athletes, which made all the physical training a little bit tougher because we were competing against some track guys, some football players. One guy had been a high school All-American football player, you know. One of my best friends ended up being a guy that was a defensive tackle at Brigham Young. He was a devout Mormon, he and his wife. His wife had been a cheerleader at Brigham Young. Anyway, they were our neighbors after my wife joined us after OCS. Okay, so OCS, 12 weeks, didn't gain any weight because they ran it off of us. I made the mistake of putting too much on my first tray, another first day mistake. We go to eat chow. You stand at attention the whole time. You sit down. You do not speak while eating. And their DIs are just roaming the whole area. And I put too much food on. I didn't get it eaten in 5 minutes or 3 minutes or whatever it was. The boot camp guys knew what was coming, so they just put a little food on. And so here I am. So you're supposed to go over and dump if you have anything, you know, and hand the tray back in. I had food, uneaten food. The DI said, "Open your mouth." And they started stuffing food down my mouth. I learned a terrible lesson that day. I had to swallow a lot of food without anything to drink, and it was not a fun thing. So, lots of hard lessons that changed my life completely. And I learned what real discipline was, military discipline, Marine Corps type discipline. And those guys were tough. I mean, we were in OCS, in boot camp in those days. Those were the days where DIs would slap guys around. In OCS, they were more sophisticated about it. They didn't really have to do that. They could PT you until you were a mess lying on the floor, and they would do that. And in many other ways. But with some of the bigger guys that would have been athletes, and these DIs were big, and they were combat veterans, and bad fighting, and they would go right up to them, and And if the big guys messed up, they would punch them in the stomach. And another guy, a good friend of mine, Jim Growalski, had been an offensive guard at Miami of Ohio. Real nice guy. And we served together in Vietnam for a time. But we were marching one day with our M14s. We went through training with M14s to begin with. We didn't see an M16 until after we had a commission. So you march and you know, there's a certain, you know, all the marching out on the parade deck, that's about discipline too. Moving as one, you know, no bouncing, just perfectly synchronized. And Jim messed up during an inspection arms, and so the DI said, pull the bolt back. He pulled it back. He said, stick your thumb in there. So Jim stuck his thumb in there, and he hit that bolt, and of course Jim's just, you know. So anyway, he gets his thumb out, you know, it's bruised, cut. So they disciplined the toughest guys. They weren't letting anybody up at it.
The Marine thumb.
Yeah. And it didn't matter how cold it was. I mean, when we went through the first few days of processing, we stood outside at attention in the cold without coats for I don't know how long. And nobody went to sick bay. Nobody went to sick bay because, you know, you were just showing weakness if you went to sick bay. I didn't go to sick bay until the final PFT, and there was snow on the ground, and I was running. It was a 3-mile run, and there was a cable fence, pretty low hanging, had metal poles, and it was covered in drifted snow. I didn't know it. I hit my knee on one of those poles sticking up, ripped it open, and it was like just a few days, maybe a week before we were supposed to graduate. Well, my knee swelled up, you know, I had this deep gash, and so another candidate named Fotheringham, I don't know how I remembered his name, he carried me on his back to the sick bay, which was real close by, fortunately. And Navy hospital corpsman, Vietnam veteran. He'd seen a lot of combat. Looked at it and he went, looked at me. He said, we'll put a butterfly strip on it. It needed stitches, but it's okay. So that night, it swelled up. And the pole was rusty, but I didn't get blood poisoning. But it swelled up. And when the DIs looked at it, they said, okay, we'll give you bed rest, you know. So I had about a day and a half of bed rest before our 3-day war to end OCS. And the senior DI, Staff Sergeant T.T. Big Red Puita, came up to me and he said, Fears, he said, if you don't show up for the war, we're going to recycle you. Well, there was no way. I was not going to be recycled. He said, we're going to recycle you or we're going to send you down to Parris Island. The message was clear. So I wrapped it, I think, with a little something. Anyway, fortunately it was cold outside. I mean, really super cold. We had on long johns. And but I put something over that cut, maybe some tape, I don't know, and went out, and I made it okay. They took me out there, joined my unit, and I think the cold weather kept it from swelling, and maybe just getting up and kind of walking on it. But that first couple of days, when I turned over in bed, the fluid would just, it was like somebody was in there with a razor. And then I turn on this side and the fluid would go over here. Anyway, it all went well. I graduated. My wife comes up for graduation. My parents come up for graduation. Beautiful ceremony. But when I had to go meet my wife and give her, I'd rented an apartment. One weekend they allowed us to go out, married, to rent an apartment for our wives. Judy came up with her sister to help care for our baby boy. And so I gave her the key. She didn't recognize me. My head was shaved. Her sister said, "Well, there he is right there." My wife looked at me like I was a stranger, you know. Well, they went to the apartment, and somebody had stolen all the furniture out of the apartment and actually had ripped the cabinets off the wall. So they stayed at a motel that night, and she found the manager the next day. He got another apartment for us. Really good guy. I think he was a former Marine. So that was her first night in Quantico. So it was not the greatest night for her, but there's a little town right by the base called Triangle, and that's where we had an apartment. Mm-hmm. And our neighbors were Marines too, and that's where I met Dry Lake, who had been a defensive tackle out at Brigham Young. He became an artillery officer eventually, and went to Fort Sill. The Marine Arty officers get their Arty training there at Fort Sill with the Army. And,
what branch did you go into?
The what?
What branch did you go into?
Well, I ended up running convoys in Vietnam. I mean, you know, when I was at Camp Books, which is kind of northwest of Da Nang, kind of down at the base of the High Van Pass, yeah, by a bridge called Namo Bridge. Anyway, you know, I had perimeter duty, and they ran little patrols around.
Tell me about going to Vietnam.
We flew out of California. It was either Travis or Norton, and I came back through either Travis or Norton Air Force bases. I can't remember which that I left from. But long trip, flew into Hawaii. It was dark when we landed and dark when we took off again. And then we flew into Okinawa for one night. They gave us some jungle utilities. And then next morning we flew on to Vietnam.
When did you land in Vietnam?
It was November the 5th, 1969. I took leave right before I left.
Yeah. When you got orders to Vietnam, what were you thinking?
Well, we had kind of, Judy and my wife and I had kind of prepared ourselves to the extent that you can, yeah, that I was going to Vietnam. And they told us, all lieutenants are going to go to Vietnam. And so I knew I was going. And I'd talked to some people. They'd sent us down to Camp Lejeune for a while for a little bit of training on running convoys. And so I kind of knew what was coming, talking to other officers that had come back, mm-hmm, and of course NCOs. The NCOs that we had out at the basic school and even in OCS, they told us what we needed to expect. And but what I didn't expect was how much I would see, because when you run convoys, you're covering a lot of territory. Well, not like commuting in the States, but I mean, usually a unit has a certain AO that they operate in. But we traveled a lot to different places. As far north as Dong Ha, as far south as Chu Lai, and then all these Marine fire bases and LZs, and so you see a lot. You just sometimes I felt like I was in a movie. Not that I was a part of it, and not that I was acting. I mean, it was like I'm seeing so much of this stuff going on, and for a while it's hard to digest it all, because you know, one convoy, they're always trying to mine the road and cut the road, or whatever road we were on. You know, you start getting off on those dirt roads, they're all mined, and some of them are really bad. But they're always trying to get to the road because we didn't carry pots and pans. We carried rounds for 155s, 8-inch artillery pieces. They don't have those 8-inchers anymore, but 155s, 105s, mortar rounds, small arms ammunition, and we carried not only, we always had a couple of tankers with diesel in one tanker, but also JP4 jet fuel for choppers. I think some choppers use the JP4 jet fuel, but we'd go to these fire bases, and to kind of protect the fuel, they'd pump it into these bladders that were down on the ground. And I mean, a rocket could come in and hit them, but they were kind of down and protected a little bit from, direct fire. And so we were a rolling ammo dump and fuel dump. And if you hit a mine with any of those, JP4 or diesel, if you hit a mine, it explodes. We had one guy that was he was killed 3 days before he was due to rotate back. And he caught on fire, and it blew him out of his cab, and he got up, and he just he was in shock, and he kept running and they tackled him, but he died.
Yeah.
And
what unit were you assigned to?
well, I was with a truck company, which was a part of the 1st Force Service Regiment, Force Logistics Command, and my unit, truck company, was at Camp Bucks. But almost all the time I was there, I was either with 7th Marines or 5th Marines, taking them, all the ammo and stuff. And so I spent a lot of my time on sleeping on those places, on those fire bases or LCs. And Hill 55, Anwa was 5th Marines. Hill 55 was 1st Marines. And then LZ Baldy and LZ Ross were 7th Marines. And so, regiments. And so that's where I spent almost all my time, and or on the road. The monsoons, going 25 miles could take you 4 hours because the paddies were swollen. It was like you were in a sea of mud. We had a mine. Actually, when you see, it's just like waves of mud when these trucks are going through. And sometimes the Jeep wouldn't even make it. You had to get out and push the Jeep, even with 4-wheel drive. One time a mine came up out of the muck, just like that. And it didn't explode. It could be that it just got wet or something, Some of their mines were kind of basic, box mines. The more sophisticated things, they'd take dud artillery rounds or 250 pounders and rig those up to explode, command detonated. But that's where I spent most of my time, was with those units. And I was on convoys almost every day. It's just the way it was, because they went through so much ammo. And the Anwa with the 5th Marines was southwest of Da Nang. It was called the Arizona. That's what Marines called it, because a lot of it looked like if you're driving out west a little bit. A lot of it was jungle there too, but I mean, so they nicknamed it the Arizona. South of that, about 25, 30 miles south of Da Nang, and west towards the Laotian border was LZ Baldy and LZ Ross. But it was an area called the Khe Sanh Mountains and Khe Sanh Valley, not to be confused with Khe Sanh. The Khe Sanh Combat Base up in northwest South Vietnam was Khesan. This was Quezon, Queson, 2 words, Quezon. There was actually a district town. It was in Quang Nam province. You had, Quang Tri, Thua Thien, I can't pronounce that province, and then up north, and then Quang Nam. Jack was killed in Quang Tin province, I think, which was south of Quang Nam. So when you run these convoys, most of them were big. And so we'd have a half dozen gun trucks, what we call gun trucks, with 50 caliber machine guns. And we always had, medevacs on call. We always had gunships, if we needed them. Usually we would have OV-10 Broncos or a Loach, those Kiowa class helicopters. Looked like an insect, kind of. Of course, Hueys and Cobras, they were everywhere. And the old 46s, CH-46s, the Army called them something else. They had a little bit, kind of or maybe the Marines had a variation of the twin-engine 46 to carry troops.
Chinooks, what we call them.
Yeah. I flew in one of those 46s, never again.
That's a hydraulics nightmare.
And anyway, why anybody would leave the firm earth to get in one of those things. Sometimes the major wanted me to go scout a route or something. No, Major, I know the route. Anyway.
What weapon did you have on you? What weapon did you have?
I carried a 45 and a K-bar knife, but I carried a M79 grenade launcher. I'd gotten pretty good with it at the basic school. I trained on the M16 at the basic school, but also on the M60, learned how to break down an M60, fire it. I fired an M60 and fired mortars. Fired a 4-deuce and an 81 mortar as part of our training on how to call those things in, but also just doing it is real helpful too. I'm not an RD officer. I'm not that sophisticated, but you give me a map with coordinates and 8 digits. If I can get 8 digits, I can call in a mortar on a 10-meter square. Got really good at map reading and navigating at night, even in the rain, using a compass that reflects. Get a flashlight, a military flashlight, charge it up so you can, you know what your azimuth has to be. You take a map, you laminate it so it's impervious to rain, which is real important in Vietnam. So you know where you're going. You shoot an azimuth. You know what your pace is. Everybody has a different length of step. You know what yours is, basically. You try to keep to that. You have a little cord if you're going through a jungle area or just a heavily forested area. And every 100 meters you tie a knot so you know how far you've gone, roughly. But you've got that. You've got to have that compass. You got to, But I got really good at that too. But they made us get good with it, and calling in supporting arms. So I always knew I had help overhead. That's real important. The OV-10s or the Loaches, they were always down there along those tree lines because you can't see in those tree lines in Vietnam. Even when you're out in the paddies, they're real thick and you can't see into them. And I'll tell you about things that happen. But so they know the road. The VC, MVA. They know the roads there. They know you're coming down the road. So you have to be aware of those things. So an M79 gave me just a little bit of firepower that was different from the 50s. I mean, the 50s tear up trees. I mean, it was a good weapon, but you know, the gun trucks were subject to mines too, and so that just gave me something. My job as a lieutenant was to be on that radio communicating. Well, I mean, had lots of, you know, got to get my people organized. I always had at least a squad, infantry squad, sometimes a platoon with me, depending on where we were going. And so that I could, if I had to, I could maneuver those troops. Anyway, you know, you have to, you're spread out, and so you have to keep your people trained on what to do if something happens at this end or happens in the middle or back, and it did many times. So you've got to depend on your NCOs and even your PFCs to know what they got to do.
What would happen?
If a mine goes off, it may just be the mine, which is bad enough. If the mine goes off, somebody's probably going to be killed. And that's just the way it was. There were no up-armored trucks. There were no Humvees. No up-armored trucks. We kind of created, we got with the engineers and got some 3/8-inch steel for the gun trucks to make a little bit of a cage. But still, those gunners were up high, and they were subject to sniper fire, and they were so high, if they hit a mine, that blast would just come right up and just, you know, blow them out in the paddy. But any truck, the guys would sandbag the bays. They put sandbags on the fenders of the trucks. We had deuce and a halves, 2.5-ton trucks, and 5 tons. And the 5 tons usually have a flatbed trailer with artillery ammo. And if you hit a mine, you're going to have, you just got to know you're going to have to get a medevac in. You got to find the guys, and usually what happens is it blows them up through the canvas roof on the cab. Sometimes it would blow an arm or a leg off, and maybe the arm or leg would still be in the cab, and the guy would be blown out. Or the guy would be shredded inside the cab, and an arm or a leg or a head would be blown out. And you know, when you see that stuff, you've got to put up a shield. You've got to create a boundary, and you can't let that stuff come through. You've got to act. And the first time we were in an ambush was November the 19th of '69. First time I was in an ambush. And we got stuck on the road. We were going down to Baldy and Ross. That was our plan. They'd had a major storm flooding before that. Anyway, so we're coming out. We get stuck. Trucks are going off in the rice paddies. We managed to get a couple of tanks out, but the tanks almost got stuck, trying to get them back up on what we called a road. So everybody had to just go like this and turn around because it was getting late, it was getting dark. And we knew there were VC units not far away. And so it took us forever, and then it was dark, and we couldn't move it. And you had checkpoints all along Highway 1, which is where this occurred, and they would shut those checkpoints down to control the road at night, and bridges, particularly, around bridges. So we're getting ready, and we're setting ducks up on that road. I'm not the convoy commander. He's up in the front of after we turned around, the back became the front, and he's up there, another lieutenant, and I was in the very back. And all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but anyway, an ARVN patrol came down. It looked like it was platoon-sized force. And that's another reason I'm wearing this today, because this is my thanks to that ARVN platoon. You know, they got a lot of bad rap in those days. Mm-hmm. So anyway, they're coming down. I'm talking to their lieutenant. He can't speak English. I can't speak enough Vietnamese, you know. Well, the VCs, they made our decisions for us. And all of a sudden, 2 RPGs came streaking out of this tree line, and it hit the side. It went into the side of the road, which was good, in the sense that the shrapnel was kind of contained a little bit because it dug into the side. The berm is what I'm trying to say on the road. And wham, wham! I mean, it was just. You know, it just broke the silence. Well, the ARVNs had already set up an M60, and they were spread out along the road, which was good. And then the fire started, machine guns, and it was just going back and forth, tracers back and forth. And so I've got my radio man, and so, you know, we're down on the middle of the road trying to figure out what to do, and nothing's happening, nobody's moving. I'd gotten all our guys ready. I said, look, we're sitting decks. Everybody would just be ready. And so all the Marines were. So our 50s started pumping some rounds into that tree line, kind of blind. They were just shooting, trying to, you know. And then some mortars started coming in. So I knew it wasn't just a couple of snipers out there. I mean, and so I got my radio man, and then it's completely pitch black. Mine's pitch black to this side of the road. Rice paddies out to tree lines on this side. So I had him, I said, just stay behind me, get down, stay behind me, and watch behind us, because I didn't know how many VC there were. So I got on the phone. So I got in. I said, you know, be advised, we're taking RPGs and automatic weapons fire to headquarters. And eventually they got a C-130 to drop some big basketball flares, eventually. But it was nighttime, and, you know, you can't ask for infantry troops to come and save you at night. That's just not going to happen. So I'm talking, then, I don't know, a round hit the aerial. You know, we had the big whip aerials on the trucks, and the Jeep in this case. And I'm talking on this radio, it's 110s, I don't know what, not a prick 25. And all of a sudden, I'm talking away, and then I hear from headquarters, they said, we can't hear you. Or, basically, he said, or you know, do you read? Do you read? And I said, yeah, I read. Well, finally I realized I could talk to the front of my convoy, to the lieutenant up there, but neither one of us had comm with our headquarters. It's just weird, you know, stuff that happens with radios in those days. So they would ask me questions. Do you have casualties? Say, you know, click once, yes, click twice. And so they asked me a series of questions. And so I key my handset. You know, when the radio's on, you've got this static. So you key it, and it breaks the static. And so they were able to figure out some things by me doing that. But finally, I just said, we got to get out of here. And so we did. They said, well, we've got barbed wire across the road up here in these different checkpoints. I said, run them. I said, we're sitting ducks up here. So anyway, we managed to get going, got out of there. And that was my first, it was not bad in the sense that we didn't have anybody killed. And we were lucky because we had that ARVN unit who were pumping out rounds right away. So this is for them. That was kind of a wake-up call. I mean, I'd been on convoys, not as convoy commander. I was just trying to learn where we were going and all that kind of stuff. So there were always airstrikes and arty missions, all up and down the sides, off the road and stuff. Or you'd hear a firefight. You know that sound of a firefight in the distance. It's got that, and it just kind of expands and you kind of go down. But all of that stuff is going on, but it hadn't involved me yet. That's when I realized that those RPGs, those were real. And I lost my hearing for about a week in one of my ears. It was this ear, because I was over here, and wham, and I lost my hearing for about a week. It was just loud ringing. But anyway, finally it came back. Obviously, it made some damage. So anyway, and I remember I got back and I had my .45, and I realized my .45 was in my holster cocked. And I was nervous. I wasn't nervous while it was going on at all. In fact, I was never nervous when shooting was going on. It was afterwards. And when we were safe, relatively safe somewhere. And I'd be like that, And last for a while, and that would go away. Never had bad dreams, but the shakes after I'd see something really bad, would go on for a while. But then I started taking over the convoys, and I'd seen some dead VC even when I was just learning things the first couple of weeks. And dead VC didn't really bother me. You look because there's a dead body, and maybe you see it in the morning, you see it laying there in the back, because people, if it was via cog, they wouldn't come out and retrieve the body. And bodies would blowed up, and when it was warmer, and you'd see them all shot up and stuff. But then, especially before Ross got hit, when we hit those mines, we were going down to Ross from Baldy, and this corporal came up to me. He had some Marines trying to get back to their company down at Ross. He said, "Can I tag along?" It was one of those bad roads. I mean, it was just, we lost 10 trucks on that road in 1 week period, one particular week. And it wasn't just us. Anybody else going down that road was having, and it was like blown up truck holes, burned. There was a chopper that was melted, been shot down and melted. Just all this stuff that had been blown up all down that road. And so anyway, I told this corporal, sure, tag along. And I said, work yourself inside the trucks we've got. And I had 2 tanks. I always took tanks because we'd follow in their treads so that they would, a small mine might blow up their tread, but they'd be okay. But a truck's different. And so I'd tell my drivers, stay in those behind their treads. Their tread marks on the road. Don't get out on the shoulder. Don't do anything. Stay in those things. Well, this was a command detonated mine, and and they waited. Let the tanks go by, let that lead gun truck go by, and then here come all these Marines sitting in the back of I think it was a deuce and a half, and boom, I'm trying to remember how many dead. There were several dead, and just, blown up, their bodies burned, from the blast. Some people civilians may not know when there's a blast, it's not just shrapnel, there's a fireball when round goes off. And when you hit a mine, you're basically within just 8 feet, 8 feet of the blast, so that engulfs them, and so they get burned, and it's just not good. One of the Marines got blown out into the rice paddy, missing arms and legs, and but couldn't find him. And you don't just stop because a mine can signal an ambush. So you're moving. You want to get the medevacs in and get them out. And so the dead and wounded, and so they didn't find him. Well, that was January 5th, the afternoon of January 5th, 1970. So anyway, the road was blown up. So we had to go back to Baldy because paddies were swollen. And I think we had a diesel truck too. So it was real hard to turn around. You're just kind of going like that. But we had to get back to Baldy. And that was after the medevacs were called in. And there was a couple of cobras circling around. And then, so we get back, and then about 1:30 the next morning at Ross, they'd had some intel that there was a VC battalion coming their way, and sure enough, they got hit that night. There were, a couple of hundred mortar rounds. We were sitting at Baldy, and you could hear it, and there was like 200 or so. I didn't count them, but that's what they said. A couple of hundred mortar rounds. There were sappers. They went through the front area of what I call the front of the fire base, and tossed satchels in a couple of Marine bunkers, killed the Marines in there, and then they were inside. And then you have follow-up people coming in. And the fighting was real heavy. And there was a guy from Bartlesville who, by the way, was with 7th Marines. Anyway, I'll tell you more about that. So they were fighting, and they eventually kicked them out. The VC left like 38, 39 dead, something. That's what they counted right there, but there were blood trails going everywhere. And patrols later found some shallow graves around there. There was a CB unit there, and there were, I think, 13 Marines and combined Marines and CBs killed, 63 wounded, so some real serious casualties. But they're out of ammo. They were low on ammo anyway, so now they're out of ammo for certain guns. So at dawn, we're headed south with tanks, and I've got gunships, and I've got an OV-10. We're not taking any chances because we know that VC unit's somewhere, even if it's shot at, which it was. And so we're going down, and I remember this feeling like, it's just going to happen. It's going to happen. It happened yesterday, it's going to happen. And so I just kind of relaxed. It was like I just kind of said, it's going to happen. There's nothing I can do about it. Just, And so it was almost, I was looking down at myself. I don't want to make this melodramatic or anything, but it was like, okay. So we went down, and not a single shot was fired, nothing, which was fine, of course. But it was just like, after the mines blowing up that truck with those Marines in it, blood and gore, and then going down the next day and nothing. And after what happened to Ross, so we get there. Well, it's a mess because the sappers had blown up a bunch of stuff. They killed a couple of sappers inside hooches. They'd gone inside hooches and hidden, and they killed one VC officer who was sitting at a desk going through papers when some Marines walked in on him and they shot him at the desk, sitting in a desk. Anyway, but it was real sad. Well, Larry Stamper was a guy in the class of '63 at Norman High School. I played church league basketball with him. Well, if Larry was there, he was a RDFO. He was a forward observer lieutenant. And so I knew he was there. So as soon as I got there, I started looking around for him. And fortunately, he was out when the attack occurred. He had a four-man team out on a mission. And so he wasn't there. So I wrote home on that photograph of me in the Jeep. I wrote home on that, and I said, tell Larry's mom he's okay. And so Judy I sent that to Judy. Judy called my mom and said, call Larry Stamper's mom and tell her he's okay, because apparently a news crew came down, and it was reported in the papers too. So Mom called Mrs. Stamper and said, well, next week I see Larry, and so I'm going up to him and said, hi, how you doing? He said, why did you tell my mom I was okay? I said, well, you don't have any holes in you. I was just kind of laughing about it. And he was real serious because he told his mom he was in a real safe desk job. And he was absolutely safe, and there was no problem. He's out on an FO on these small teams. I felt bad because it scared his mom, and that was not my intent. But I learned a real serious lesson about life, You just don't do things unless you have permission when it comes to family. And so I apologized to Larry and everything. And he ended up back at Camp Pendleton with me. And he was able to look at it a little bit more lightheartedly.
Where was your base camp in Vietnam? Where were you based in Vietnam?
A place called Camp Books.
Camp Books. Okay.
It was just off of Highway 1. As you're headed out of Da Nang, it's all built up now, but as you're headed out of, it was kind of on the northwest, not on the edge of town, but it was northwest of Da Nang. And you could see the Hai Van Pass if you looked up like that. And of course the road going up over the pass and then north would go on up through it'd go on up through Hue Phu Bai and on up to Dong Ha.
What's the name of the pass?
Hai Van Pass.
Hai Van Pass.
There's a Vietnamese name for it. The translation of Hai Van Pass is the pass of the clouds, because it was so high. You know how in the monsoon, particularly, clouds that obscure the mountaintops, and this peak really shot up there, and we'd go up there. There were some old French bunkers up there. There were Marines up there too. So when we go north, the road was protected. And then China Beach Orphanage was kind of down from the Hai Van Pass there, down on the beach too. So anyway, Camp Books was out there. It was named after a Marine that was killed there in an attack. And we got hit there a couple of times. Nothing real serious. One time they did come through the wire. They blew up a couple of old, tin buildings or something like that. And the engineers put up a sign. There was a perimeter road inside the outer concertina wire. And there was an inner road, and they came across that road and blew up these buildings before they were kicked back out. But the engineers put up a sign on that road that said, "Caution, VC crossing." They drew a little stick figure with a conical hat and an AK-47. The general didn't like it. I thought that was the coolest coolest sign I saw the whole time I was in Vietnam. "Caution, VC crossing." And they put down Agent Orange along the outside. They put down CS gas and Agent Orange to keep the vegetation down. And our bunkers were all along out there too. And I had perimeter duty all the time when I was there, but we had it was just too well defended. They couldn't get enough troops to us to do us any, because there was so much open ground. They couldn't really get enough troops at us to do any damage. So, I mean, they do probes and stuff there. Our battalion CP was hit by a rocket. My bunker, I say my bunker, the bunker that was assigned to my group of guys where we, near our hooch, got hit by a bunker. It was an outdoor bunker, got hit by a rocket. And so it was blown up. So we dug a new bunker. We had an engineering officer, lieutenant. And so he got his guys together. We dug right down through the floor of our hooch, so we wouldn't have to run outside to a trench that they dug real quick. And it had a hatch on it with a rope handle, so we could crawl if we had to and pull that top off and just go straight down into this bunker. And he was an engineer. He had it fixed up, so it was a real well-built thing, down about 6 feet, something like that, I don't know. And of course, like most hooches, we had sandbags all around the hooch and everything. One day I came back from a convoy and it was monsoon, it was just wet, so I had to go in and get all the grime and mud off of me. And there was another lieutenant getting a shower too, so it happened. All of a sudden, a mortar round came in, just wham, a couple more came in, but it was just some guy trying to cause a panic. They'd pop off 3 rounds and take off before you could lock in on where they were at. That 3 rounds was a usual sequence for something like that. But anyway, it hit, siren goes off. So instinctively, this other lieutenant and I, we just dropped down on the floor of this shower thing, and we gotta go somewhere, So he went to some bunker. He was somebody. He wasn't in my hooch. He went somewhere else, and we had wood flooring over the sand outside the bunker, going back to our hooch. So I get on that, and I'm kind of on all fours and stuff, and I'm going like that. Well, there's sand, and it's wet. So anyway, all this sand is caking, and I'm wet, and I'm trying to get to the bunker, go in through the doorway, and the bunker's real close. So it's already open, of course. And so I grabbed my helmet, which was inside the hooch. I'm naked as a jaybird, and I put on my helmet, and I drop down in the bunker, and I go down, and here are these other 2 lieutenants. They got on flak jackets. They're, jungle camouflage utilities and their helmets, and they're down there, and I drop down. And we had a light, a flashlight or something down there, and they're looking at me, And I made a note last night. It was like they were looking at the wild man from Borneo. Because now I'd taken a shower, but now I'm just caked with sand, and I'm naked. And I come down there, and then they just start laughing. And boom, didn't matter. They're laughing, and they're rolling. and then I started laughing, and we're all down there laughing. And then another round goes off somewhere, and then that's it. And pretty soon a couple more lieutenants come, and they hear us laughing down there. And finally, the other two guys said, "I got to get out of here." And so so I was the butt of jokes for at least 2 weeks. You got any clothes on today, Fears? Anyway, so that was a humorous time in the midst of a war, and you got to take advantage of laughs whenever you can. And so I am proud to have provided a little humor for my fellow lieutenants. But there was lots of stuff. I made a bunch of notes about other things too. But let me tell you about some things that happened. I mean, snipers were a constant problem, and it's not. I'm not just talking about me. That didn't make me brave because a sniper popped off rounds at me, But that was a constant problem in Vietnam. If you're outside the wire somewhere, but even when I was inside the wire, I had a sniper fire a couple of rounds, and finally some corporal said, "Get over here." He was behind some sandbags, and so I jumped over there, and he missed me. But after a while, sometimes you kind of get used to it, which is dangerous. And another time, we were on a convoy, going through this little village, and this guy had come up right between, not between, but among midday civilian traffic. Mm-hmm. And he had an SKS, so he was just a VC. He wasn't, but a VC can kill you just as dead as anybody else. And he aimed right at us, and he missed us. He went wham, like that. And I don't know if it went, we were in a Jeep. I don't know if it went in front of the windshield or like this. A radio man was driving, and I was sitting here, and it just wham, like that. And then I turn and look, and he's running. And I've got a gun truck right behind me, and I know I can tell that gun truck to start firing, we could have stopped and shot him, but there were just civilians all around, and just that little thing in the back of your head, yeah, this is a war, but you can't do things like that. And so he went off. I don't know what he did after that. I hope he didn't kill any Americans, but he was mad about something. Mm-hmm. And it took some guts for him to come up like that and shoot right at us. I'll give him that much respect. And but I realize I have to pull back. You can't just start shooting at people. And then another time, a Korean Marine saved my life. The guy was shooting from a tree line. The bridge had been blown up by the VC, and we were slowed down, and we're trying to get around this one little makeshift. It was a small bridge, fortunately, so they put in a makeshift bridge, but it slowed us up and stuff. And so I was standing out, and all of a sudden somebody was yelling at me. I looked down. This Korean was down there. He had an M1, which is what they carried M1s, and he was saying, well, I knew, I'd heard something, but I was concentrating on us getting through this bridge, and he wheeled around, and so but I took cover in there, and sometimes early when I first got there, it's like, why are they shooting at us? It's that it goes away real quick, but it's like, what did I do? But it was a problem. There's so many things I want to tell you. I'll tell you about one more funny thing. Not funny, but just unusual and humorous. I was on Hill 55, where the 1st Marines were. We were unloading. Well, there was a USO-sponsored Filipino rock band on the back of a flatbed trailer, and they were playing some music. Well, they were singing a Beatles song, Hard Day's Night. That was their next song. They played some song, I don't know what it was. Then they went into Hard Day's Night, and they sang with an accent. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way. They're not English speaking. And so they were singing with an accent, but it was Hard Day's Night. Well, we've been fired on. Hill 55 had been fired on by either NVA or VC, I don't know which, on the hill opposite of us. And so someone on 55 called in an airstrike on them. Either someone on 55 or a patrol outside, you know, because that was near Charlie Ridge. That was dangerous territory there. And so they called in a couple of Phantoms and F4s. So rolled in, not directly over us, but like this, to hit that hill, and they dropped 250 pounders. I mean, that's what it looked like to me, with each pass. But here's this band, and they're saying, "It's gonna be a hard day's night," and boom, you know. Then the jet, you know how you got the afterburners as they're climbing and tailing off. Then the other one come in and do the same thing they did. I know, they rolled in a couple of times, maybe 3 times, like, "It's going to be hard," and they never stopped playing the whole time. And so the sergeant was next to me, and I learned he was a sergeant, and his nickname was Sergeant Grit. Remember that movie, True Grit?
Yes.
Well, his buddies knew he was from Oklahoma, and that was supposed to be said, and so they called him Sergeant Grit. And anyway, I met him, and he started a marine novelty store selling marine goods, all kinds of stuff, and was very successful and sold it recently to somebody in Little Rock, Arkansas. But I was talking to him one day before I went back over to buy a map, and we figured out we were there. I told him this story, and he was the sergeant, and because it wasn't one of my sergeants. He said, "Yeah, that was me. I was watching it too." And what I said to him was, at the time, I said, "Are you going to write home to what we're seeing?" You know, it was so surreal or something. I don't know because they never stopped singing "It's Going to Be a Hard Day's Night" the whole time. And he said, "No." He said, "I don't think anybody would believe it."
What was his name? Sorry.
Huh?
What was his name? Sorry.
I'll find out.
Okay.
I'll find out. But he went by Sergeant Grit so much, everybody just called him Sergeant Grit. And that was the name of his store.
Yeah.
He was a communicator. He was a radio man.
Okay.
But he became a sergeant, so he was in charge of all the radios for this one unit, for an entire company. And he was with the 1st Marines. And so anyway, and we both had a little laugh and everything, but it was just so strange in the middle of this war, and they're playing a song that seemed to go with what was happening. Yeah. So anyway, that happened. I want to tell you, there's more things that happened in combat, but I want to tell you about the Bob Hope show. And the reason I want to tell you is it wasn't just the privilege of seeing Bob Hope, which was great. I mean, lieutenant friend of mine and I went. I'd come back from a convoy, and so I didn't have a convoy the next day, and so they said, "Well, would you like to go to Bob Hope?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, I guess, yeah." And he said, "Well, he's going to have a Christmas show at Freedom Hill." Freedom Hill was Hill 327, close to the bay there in Da Nang. But Marines called it Freedom Hill. And Naval Hospital was there, China Beach.
Yeah.
The TV show China Beach was kind of about all of that, especially the Naval Hospital. They tell you about the guy that created it because he was in my company at OCS. His name was William Broyles. But anyway, we went to this show. Connie Stevens was kind of the lead female star, and we had the Gold Digger dancers. But we also had, and we didn't know this, but Neil Armstrong was the special guest. And he had just gone to the moon in July of '69. And he was going with hope all around Vietnam. And he spoke, and it was just a wonderful presentation he made. He was very thoughtful, calm little speech that he gave. He took some questions. And of course, everybody was in awe of him. It was Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, you know. And that happened. But there was also a couple of other things. The Gold Digger dancers included one young woman from the Dean Martin show in those days. Had one young woman who had a brother that was in the Marines in Vietnam, and he was in an infantry unit. And but they had told her that he wouldn't be able to come to the show. So she was disappointed. But that was a ruse. And Bob Hope had arranged for her brother to be brought in out of the field. And he did. So they had this skit where the girls were dancing with some of the guys, and they had, you know, thousands of Marines, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 Marines on the side of this hill. We were just sitting there. I went with a fellow lieutenant, and we got up on a little ledge, had good seats. And so anyway, they're dancing with some of the guys from the audience. I think one of the wounded who was able to get up there, one of the girls danced with him. They had lots of wounded down in front from the Navy hospital there. And so anyway, they bring her brother up from backstage. She doesn't know it. The whole troop, they all know about it except her. And so they kind of, you know, usher him up there, and then he taps her on the shoulder and says, "Can I cut in?" You know, and you could hear it on the microphone. "Can I cut in?" So she kind of turned around. Well, she just burst in tears. She just melted. I mean, she was done for the day. It was her brother, big brother, you know. And so everybody just gives them a standing ovation. It was just a wonderful, wonderful scene. And of course, they laughed, and I'm sure he spent some time with her for at least the rest of that day. And it was a real sweet thing to do for her, and of course Hope got it done. And so anyway, it was a great show. Connie Stevens sang Silent Night. It was very moving. She was tearful when she was singing, and of course she went through the hospital there. All those entertainers went through all the hospitals, and she did too. And so they saw the worst of the worst wounded. And when she sang that, all the guys in the audience joined in, and it was a little bit of home that afternoon. And I'm glad I went, and I'm glad I saw what I saw. And Hope was funny, and Les Brown and his band of renown was with him, of course. And I think there were a couple of other entertainers, but Connie Stevens and the Gold Digger dancers were really good, and Hope was, I don't know, he made himself the butt of all the jokes and all that kind of stuff. So it was a good day. But it was also important to me because the next day, the guy that I went with had the convoy, or had one of the convoys, and so he went down. And then I got Major sent a runner for me and said, "You got to come to the headquarters." And said, okay. So I went on over, and he said, you know, convoy commander, this lieutenant I'm talking about, he wasn't a close friend, but he was one of the guys, you know. And I to this day, I can't remember his name, and I'm going to do some research and find out who it was. But he was wounded by a Chicom grenade. Who knows how it happened? You know, walking by. We used to go so close to hooches and things, and the tree lines. It could just be, or just somebody going up and down, some civilian going up and down the road. There was a beast and toss a hand grenade, and he lost a portion, some of his fingers and a portion of his hand, and some shrapnel hit him in the eye as well, and peppered his face. And I don't know if he saw it or if he tried to grab it or hit it or what, but they had me go down and take over his convoy. So I jumped in a gun truck, and we headed down there. And so I went over. They'd already medevaced him by the time I got down there. So I went over to his command jeep and his sergeant, and I got in the jeep. And I don't know why. I don't know if we're getting ready to come back or why, but I got in the jeep, and I put my feet down, and it was just, you know, gooey and sticky and stuff. And so I got out, and then I looked down in. There's monsoon, so it wasn't sunshine, you know. But I looked down, and then I looked around the edges of my boots, and I had his blood. I'd stepped in his blood, you know, and it was in the footwell, and I had it on my junk, you know, around the heels and along there, and so he had bled a heck of a lot, and so I told the radio man, just drive the jeep. I'm going to hop in one of the gun trucks to go back. I grabbed something and wiped off my boots and everything, but it was just almost a sick feeling, you know. He was a real good guy. He had been a teacher, and went to OCS, and he was going to go back and be a teacher after his 3 years were up and everything. And I hope he did. I don't know, but he's a good guy. But I was just so glad that we got to go to that show, and that he got to have have a good time before that happened to him. So, anyway, you know, just there's so many things. And it doesn't make you brave. It's just sometimes you feel like a witness. You know, we went into this village called Thanh My, Thanhmy. And it was on the south side of the Ba Rin River Bridge. The Ba Rin River, called Song Ba Rin. There were two other rivers, big rivers that we crossed, but this was the Ba Rin River. And the village was down there. And we were coming back from a convoy. It's on Highway 1. We're coming back from the convoy, and all of a sudden, mortars just start coming down. I'm not far behind the lead gun truck. Mortars are blowing up. And so I'm telling people, keep moving, you know, everybody keep moving, mortars, keep moving, keep moving. And so we get into the village square. There's a CAP unit, a combined action platoon is what the Marines called it. It was a concept where it was half Marines, half Vietnamese troops. And there was a CAP unit in there. So we get in there, and just civilians that got hit. And so I've got my corpsman in the gun truck with me, so we hop out. And I'm going to try to keep the trucks moving because I didn't want us to become add to the target. Mm-hmm. So we get out, and there's a little boy, and his leg is all messed up. Actually, I mean, he had more shrapnel too, but his leg was, there was no way they were going to be able to save that leg. And the corpsman in the cap unit was working on him, but he died. I think he, 2-3 years old, something like that. It was just made me so angry, because it was a resettlement village, and they'd been hit a few months before that, and they came in at night, killed over 100 civilians, just murdered them. Go from family bunker, tossing in satchel charges. They pinned down the cap unit, and then they were, anyway. Well, and then they did it a month after I left to come home. They hit it again, huge losses of civilians. But this time they just mortared the place. And so, anyway, I've got my corpsman. I said, okay, help out with whoever you can, But this little boy dies, and the corpsman, he's got to move on to other people. And those corpsmen, I mean, they were like Army medics, same thing. So those guys they all deserve a Medal of Honor, for what they see and have to try to take care of. And so this little boy died, but he had to get up. He had to get up, move on to some other people. And then they brought up this man that had been hit, and I kept kind of looking at him. My corpsman was going to try to work, and I kept looking at him, and he was conscious. He was down, kind of, but he was kind of propped up and looking. He wasn't crying or yelling or anything. But there was something odd about him, and his hands were like this. And I looked down, and he was holding his intestines. And what had happened is shrapnel had just hit him from one of the mortars. Had hit him right in the gut. And the pressure in a gut wound, it always pushes. But you got to have surgery. And I was thinking, I'm looking at a dead man, because we're out here in the middle of nowhere, and they brought him up to see if we could do something. He was just holding his intestines, and I think my corpsman kind of patched things up, and when I say patch, they put a bandage over it. Filthy conditions and everything, and so anyway, I'm mad about that little boy. Yeah. And of course, my little boy is about the same age as that little boy, and I'm sure psychologically that's what struck a chord with me. I was mad at the VC for doing that to their own people, and but anyway, so I'm getting people running through and stuff like that. But I was just so angry for a long time there, and again, it was one of those instances where you've got to pull back, and you've got to, not. It's not that you forget about it, but you got to put it behind you. And
how long were you in Vietnam?
I wasn't there all that long. I was there about 6 months and a week.
5 months.
Is that right?
No.
They were trying to get new lieutenants in.
Yeah.
And before because they were drawing down on the forces.
What are you thinking about leaving Vietnam?
I was glad I was leaving. I wanted to see Judy, but they were sending me to Okinawa first. And so I was kind of upset about that, but that's just the way it was. Yeah. And you have lots of emotions, and Jim Growalski, who I mentioned, he'd been up at Quantico, came down to our place, and we left on the same plane on the C-130. We were buckled in. There was a airplane propeller they had on there, and a bunch of crates and stuff like that. And it's cold at one end and not so cold at the other, and they give you sandwiches, So C-130 to Okinawa, and then we both spent the rest of our time there, and then came back. And But Judy wanted to have a big, I'll do this real quick. Judy wanted to have she'd been sick, terribly sick. And I want to say this about all those families, even whether it's our parents, they worried 24 hours a day. It was awful for them. She got real sick, was misdiagnosed by a bad doctor in Tulsa, got down to 87 pounds by the time I saw her. She's not the biggest girl, but 87 pounds, and she couldn't take care of our son. She couldn't cook, so she moved in with her aunt, and they were just wonderful people. And of course, my parents worked, and her parents worked, and so they would try to help on the weekends and stuff, but it was awful for them. And they didn't know when we were relatively safe. And we didn't want them to know that somebody tried to kill us that day either. But so they just were. They saw the news every night.
Would you join the Marines again?
Other people have asked me that too, and I would. It was tougher because I had a wife and child, and that makes it difficult to say. But I think I would join again. I would do some things differently after I was in.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm older now, and I would have tried to be a better officer, but you can't do that with 20/20 hindsight. But I join again.
When you hear Vietnam, what do you think of?
What do I think of? It's still a communist dictatorship. When I went back in 2000, we had to deal with people's committees in each of the villages. The people themselves were very friendly to us, but there were some hardcore communists around. They persecute Christians really bad, or anyone that tries to ask for, due process. What they did to those South Vietnamese soldiers, mostly low-ranking people, those were war crimes. I'm sorry.
We're bad out of tape.
That's okay.
Okay. This is an excellent interview.
Well, I didn't know where to start, where to begin, and my memory was such. I made these notes last night. Some dates was this before that,
But I want to thank you for your service and thank you for the interview.
Well, thank you, Joe. I've taken up so much of your time, but again, what you're doing is so very important. Anyway, I made some notes. I don't know if you want to even take time to look at them.
Sure.
But I wanted to mention, let me just tell you,
real
for
quick.
you.
Okay.
We had a hospital that we started at Camp Brooks for the Vietnamese. It's called Hoa Can. That was the nearby village to Camp Brooks. And it treated Vietnamese children who had been wounded or who were really sick and didn't have family, or very few families.